Hello, so today I want to discuss about childhood trauma and the juvenile justice system, as well as mental health and how all three of those really relate to each other. It's something that is often overlooked and not seen or enough research is done, so I want to discuss some of the research that is there and give some of my thoughts about kind of what's going on and how they're so closely linked. My presentation plan for today is to first start with an introduction, give you some facts, talk about why it's important and kind of what's going on. And then the second part, I'd like to talk about trauma and mental health, give a deep dive in that, talk about how they're interconnected with one another, just kind of give you some definitions and talk about why they're important. Thirdly, I want to do a deep dive into the juvenile justice system and talk about some of the things that are going on with that. And then fourth, I want to relate all of those together. So trauma, mental health, and the juvenile justice system, talk about how they're interconnected and how they are playing off one another. Fifth, I'd like to talk about the child welfare services role, which I think is really important and could be a really important way to target to help some of these kids that are in the juvenile justice system. And finally, to wrap up, I just want to talk about why it matters, why it's important, and why we should care about it. So, I have three really alarming statistics that I have on the screen here that I'd like to share. So, one third of children in the juvenile justice system have experienced childhood maltreatment. That was found in a study by Goodkind. And then children in the juvenile justice system are twice as likely to have a history of trauma. That was found by Yoder in 2017. And thirdly, 9 to 29% of children who have been maltreated engage in delinquent behavior. So, as you can see, these are some pretty alarming statistics and can show you why it's so important that we look into this and look into the juvenile justice system and what we're doing for these kids and how we can help them. I do want to put a little side note in here that I do recognize that how we define childhood maltreatment has changed over time and with history. But I do want to say that these are pretty recent statistics, so it's safe to say that the maltreatment that they're talking about here is probably going to fall under the abuse or neglect category. Some other things I'd like to mention is that mental health problems and childhood trauma both correlate with the likelihood of children being involved in the youth justice system. And research has also suggested that when mental health services are provided at the juvenile justice system level, recidivism rates and reoffending rates go down. To start off our discussion, I want to lay the groundwork for what I'm talking about and some of the terms that I'm using. So, when I say childhood trauma, I am talking about an exposure to disturbing event or events in childhood that leaves lasting impacts on individuals' well being. So, that could be their mental well being, their physical well being, which we'll talk a little bit more about with adverse childhood experiences, but any way that it impacts their well being. Then, when I talk about childhood abuse, this includes physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, as well as child exploitation and neglect. And then finally, when I talk about mental health, I'm referring to psychiatric disorders or disturbances, including but not limited to depression, PTSD, and anxiety. So now that we've laid the groundwork, let's talk a little bit more about childhood trauma and the forms that it comes in. So, childhood trauma, it's not just abuse, there's a lot of other things that can go into it. So, it could be physical, emotional, or sexual abuse or neglect, but it could also be something like a natural disaster that destroys their home, or sex trafficking, or terrorism, community violence, domestic violence, just witnessing substance abuse. There's a lot of different ways that childhood trauma can manifest. Now, in my presentation, I'm talking more in the child abuse realm just because it relates a lot to child welfare services and it relates to the juvenile justice system. But I do want to mention that trauma that's not abuse can still impact individuals and impact their risk in going into the juvenile justice system. So it puts them at risk, it puts them at a worse position. So those are children that still need our help. Now, a term that gets thrown around a lot when talking about childhood trauma is adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. So, this is basically just a way of quantifying child abuse or child trauma. And they can do that by giving people questionnaires or surveys to evaluate for these. Now, there are some problems with using this as a scale to kind of measure child abuse experiences, child trauma experiences, because number one, what we define as childhood maltreatment has changed over time, like I mentioned earlier. So, what one person might consider is maltreatment, someone else might not, especially because there's cultural differences. Another issue that I'd like to mention that I just found in my research about adverse childhood experiences is that a lot of times they focus on how these experiences affect the physical health of someone, which is important, but they act as if the physical health is more important to look at than the mental health. And I would disagree with that. I think the physical health and the mental health impacts are just as important, and both should be looked at with care, and both should be given resources. Now, the overlap between trauma and mental health is striking. So, trauma and mental health are so interconnected, and you really can't talk about trauma by itself without talking about mental health, or at least give a whole encompassing view of trauma without taking into account mental health. And the same thing goes with mental health. You really can't describe and talk about mental health as a whole in great detail unless you talk about trauma. So I did this little diagram here, which might be kind of hard to read, and I honestly wish I could put the circles even closer together. But the point that I was trying to make here is the overlap is incredibly important to keep in the back of our heads when talking about child abuse, child trauma, and mental health. Now, let's talk about the juvenile justice system. So, supposedly, their goal is to take a rehabilitative and preventive approach and focus on keeping the children from not reoffending and putting their needs first and getting them treated for any issues that they might have. However, we know that's not really the case, and that does not happen very often. I also want to mention about who is involved in the juvenile justice system. So, 50 to 75% are estimated to have some type of mental health issue, and 40 to 80% of incarcerated youth have a diagnosable mental health disorder. This leads us really well into, I would arguably say, the theme of this presentation, or at least a key takeaway, and it would be, is the child responsible for when they break the law, or is it the community who should take responsibility? Should the child be punished, or should it be focused on rehabilitation and where the community went wrong in supporting that child? Especially when there's a lot of outside factors that are coming into play when you're talking about trauma and abuse and neglect and things that the child just absolutely cannot control. And if we know that is playing a role, then can we really blame the child and incarcerate them, especially if it's for a long period of time? When we know that it's mainly the children who have been through this trauma that are actually breaking the law. So it maybe shows that the community is more at fault for not protecting those children. Another factor that I'd like to talk about in this discussion is age, and how that relates to the juvenile justice system. And specifically, the age that I'm talking about is the age that the child is when child welfare services become involved. So that would indicate that there's some kind of child abuse and neglect or some kind of risk for that that would make child welfare services want to get involved. But when they do get involved, if the child is older and they're a teenager, the child is a lot more likely to get involved in the juvenile justice system compared to a younger child who maybe gets put in foster care, and they're younger. They're less likely to get involved in the juvenile justice system than an adolescent who gets put in foster care who's older. And that's a general statistic. It doesn't necessarily mean that the child is placed in foster care, but it's just something to think about. There's a lot of factors that go into this. I also want to mention that while I'm talking about adolescents, I'm talking about some of the factors that go into the juvenile justice system. I recognize that I'm skipping a lot of factors in the sense of socioeconomic status, race, culture. There's a lot of things that go and tie into this. I'm just talking about what um, is really related in the context of this presentation. But I recognize that all of those factors are playing a role and working together. And ultimately, leading to the final result of the child being involved in the juvenile justice system or offending or becoming a part of the criminal justice system when they turn an adult. Now we get to arguably, I think, one of the most important slides in this presentation, and that's the overlap between trauma and the juvenile justice system. And it really relates to what I was talking about and thinking about with saying, is it the child's fault? So, according to the Department of Justice, trauma screening is often overlooked at intake in the juvenile justice system because it is so prevalent. When I read that, I was just astonished. And that is directly from an article from the Department of Justice. Also, they acknowledge that trauma can cause a child to have internal problems like depression and anxiety, but they also acknowledge that trauma can cause a child to have external problems like anger outbursts and violence. So, if they recognize that trauma can play such a huge role in something like anger outbursts or violence, then we're left wondering, why are we punishing the child and incarcerating the child when perhaps there's something else that's going on that is out of the child's control, that has put them at such a high risk to become delinquent or break the law. Further, I'd like to mention that a study by Underwood and Washington in 2016 showed that mental health difficulties are both directly and indirectly linked to delinquent behavior. Now, I'd like to discuss child welfare services and their influence on the juvenile justice system and on the youth who are involved in it. I do want to make it clear, however, that I don't think that it is the people who are working at the child welfare services or even just the child welfare services themselves that are responsible for the delinquency. Um, but I do think that there's a need for resources at that level to be provided to especially adolescents to help prevent them from committing crimes later on. So, when a child is placed in a group home, they are 2.5 times at greater risk of delinquency than children who were placed in a foster home. Another study found that placement has a stronger effect on delinquency in girls than in boys. So I thought those were two pretty interesting facts, and shows that I guess the outcome of a child once they're put in child welfare services custody, how that can influence whether or not they run away or decide to commit a crime or something like that. So I think that shows the need for more foster homes as well as maybe trying to eliminate group homes and replace them with foster homes, because perhaps foster homes give a better environment for the child to grow up and flourish in. However, I do recognize that it's not necessarily a direct link. It could perhaps be that the kids that are in group homes may have more behavior issues or something like that, and that's why they're not in a foster home, which would make more sense for them to become delinquent later on. So I know that it's not necessarily causation, but it's definitely something to look at and to see if group homes really do have an effect on delinquency. So, to wrap up our discussion, I want to reiterate and continue to talk about why this matters so much. Now, I've given a lot of alarming and just really upsetting statistics already, but I want to reiterate that this is our children, our future that we're talking about, and we cannot blame them for things that are out of their control. It shows the need for resources, it shows the need for trauma informed based treatment, and it shows the need for loving these kids and taking care of them and putting them in good homes that can foster a healthy environment and help them heal from whatever they may have went through before. And it shows that we still have a lot of work to do. I really enjoyed doing some research on this and learning about it, but it's still really upsetting to know that there are a lot of children who are falling through the cracks. So, thank you, and here are my references.